went with the Liberals because I believed in the values of the dignity and worth of every individual, the importance of the family, freedom of choice, freedom of conscience, et cetera, reward for effort, etc. I don't think it's a secret to many of your listeners. I've had a few issues with our inability to uphold those values in the 3 years that I've been a senator, which I find very difficult. Because I believe that if we say we're going to do something and we have these values, we've got to be seen to fight for those values. We mightn't always win the argument, but sometimes I think it's better to lose the arguments but stand on your values than cave in and slowly the goalposts move further to the, or not the goalposts, but the outcomes move further to the left, or we appease the left in order to get an outcome that might be a short-term gain for a loss of long-term integrity.
But the fate of sitting members depends on electors in the cities and those who come many miles and by varied forms of transport to vote in outlying booths in country towns. Still, in New South Wales, they can quench their thirst as hotels are open for the first time on election day.
What hasn't high school told us, or even primary school, taught us about elections? How does Australian democracy work? I remember I was a year or two into this, and I won't name names or genders, but one of my family members asked me what the Senate does. And I'm like, how do you be my family and not know this? I'm guilty, but certainly our education system's guilty. So without commenting on the education system, how does democracy work at a federal election and parliament in Australia?
Well, okay, first of all, democracy is all about power to the people. So, 400 or 500 years ago, we had the Reformation and then the Enlightenment. And one of the great things about the Enlightenment was that, basically we had this overthrow of the kings whereby power was handed down, through hereditary sources or sometimes through a lot of violence where kingdoms were overthrown. And to a lesser degree, that still happens today. And let's hope that it stays at a lesser degree, not a higher degree. But, the key thing about democracy is it is obviously the voting process. But to me, it's more than that. It's about empowering individuals as much as possible. And in many ways, we've seen a disempowering of individuals over the last 30 to 40 years, whereby we've had the government march on into the family home, the classroom and the bedroom, telling people how to live their lives rather than letting people choose how they live their lives. And at the same time, those governments have marched out of the power stations and the dam building and off the trains and everything, and have sold all those assets and sovereign assets at that to private corporations who are no longer accountability. So democracy in a nutshell to me is empowering the individual, number one, and making sure that government is accountable, number two, and not necessarily in that order, but both very important issues. And we've seen a real eroding of that over the last 30 or 40 years, in my view. And that, unfortunately, has led to a real mistrust, a lack of trust, or a decline in trust in both governments and in many other institutions, for example, like our doctors over this recent vaccine rollout. So that's where we're at there on a general purpose. Obviously, in Australia, we have 151 lower house members, and they, serve a particular area of Australia. And then in the upper house, we have the Senate. There's 76 senators. So there's 12 senators from each state and 2 from each of the territories. In a normal half Senate, or in a normal election, you'll have a half Senate election where 6 of the 12 senators go up for re-election. In order to win a seat back, either yourself or the party that you represent has to win about 14.3% of the vote to secure a seat in the Senate. And effectively, the Senate has to pass a bill. So if a bill gets passed in the lower house, it also has to be passed by the upper house as well. The Senate also has the power to block ministers' regulations where it's an allowable instrument. So there's 2 types of laws in this country. One's legislation that's passed by Parliament, and then there's regulations that's basically just decided by the relevant minister of the day. Now, there's 2 types of regulations. There's that which is disallowable, and there's that which is allowable. And the Senate has the power also to stop allowable regulations from the minister as well. And that does happen from time to time. So I guess that's the way democracy works in a nutshell.
I'm of the opinion that the Senate has wandered from its purpose a little bit, that it's meant to be the state's house and a house of review to disallow bills regulations and legislation which are contrary to the interest of the people of the state or territory that they represent. Is there a conflict of interest when a senator also holds a portfolio? Now, as an example, I will probably cite Matt Canavan, one of the champions that definitely, I think, deserves support in this federal election. But I also noticed that there's been a marked change in his ability to speak out on any given issue, the pros, cons, the merits, the myths, since the citizenship debacle, where he lost his portfolio and basically had to justify his position, but never got his portfolio back. Do you think there's a understandable allegiance to the government when, or to the opposition, to the cabinet when a senator holds a portfolio?
Yeah, look, there is to a degree, but it's the same for lower house members as well. I mean, they have a similar conflict of interest. And you can apply that. If I own a house, do I have a conflict of interest in not wanting interest rates to go up, or do I have a conflict of interest in not wanting capital gains on, a tax on a capital gains from the sale of my house? So, sometimes there's a conflict of interest, and often sometimes there's a common interest. And I sometimes think conflict of interest gets confused with a common interest. My view is, as a senator, I have to be honest here, and I might shoot myself in the foot, but I am actually here to serve the people. As I just said, democracy is all about empowering the individual and holding government to account. Now, obviously, I'm a proud Queenslander and I'll put Queensland interests first, but I think the best way to put Queensland interests first is also to put Australia's interests first. Look, I'll be honest, if it was left to me, I'd burn the Constitution and start again, quite frankly. It's outdated. It's been completely eroded.
That's horrific. We're no longer friends.
Yeah, cool. It's been completely destroyed by High Court judgments, and the idea that we have states, power comes from the states. We've just seen with COVID that the state premiers now do nothing but just point the finger at the federal government. So we've got this, and I actually mentioned it in my maiden speech. I said there's nothing more damaging to this country than the ambiguous responsibilities and fiscal imbalance between the state and federal government. It is a complete dog's breakfast. And I said that prior to the bushfires, I said it prior to COVID, and I've said it prior to Lismore floods. If I was the Prime Minister when those Lismore floods occurred and the Premiers turned around to me, or the New South Wales Premier turned around and pointed the finger at Canberra, I would have just brought the military in and said, right, you guys, you know what? I'm sick and tired of being blamed for all this stuff. The states are responsible for emergency services. You know what? I'll get the army to do it. I'm going to start an engineering corps within the army. We'll build all the dams and bridges, and we'll take that off you. Because if you can't, run this stuff yourself without pointing the finger at Canberra every time, you can, go to hell, right? As far as I'm concerned. Now, before you're worried about too much centralisation and control, I would replace the states with about 50 super regionals, and I would push down power to local areas. Townsville, Cairns, Rockhampton, Mackay, Bundaberg, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Ipswich, Toowoomba in the west, and then a couple of areas within Brisbane.
Yep.
Because I can tell you what, mate, if you'd brought some of those COVID restrictions in and have to walk down the street as your local mayor, when people are saying, why are you destroying my business? Why are you doing this? It would have been a lot harder to do. So just have two levels of government. We're 25 million people in this country. Great Britain, a country of 65 million people, doesn't have three levels of government. New Zealand doesn't have three levels of government. I've had people contact me and say, we're going to get rid of restrictions like Britain has or New Zealand has. And it's like, well, don't ask me. It's up to the states, and they'll get rid of them when it suits their political agenda. So,
yep.
So the idea that...
That's a very long conversation I'd like to have with you at another time. I guess my very brief thought is I'd like to return to the Constitution. We've already torn it up and burned it. To go further, I think there needs to be constitutional conventions, the like of which David Flint is wanting to do. And I think part of the solution is absolutely what you said. We need many more states. Every state should be divided at least 4 or 5 times. And to go to 50 across the nation is probably not ridiculous. I'm not totally resistant to the spirit of what you're saying. I do worry, though, about starting from scratch with today's media climate. I think we would end up with a woke constitution, and I think it's much easier to restore what we started with than get something good from scratch.
That's a fair point, and look, we'll always be up against that. But yeah, fair point. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to question number 2. How do preferences work? How should people be voting? What's the technical, non-partisan way to actually use your lower house ballot and your upper house ballot for maximum democratic value and voice?
Well, look, in the lower house, it's compulsory preferential. So you have to number every box or your vote's informal. Pretty easy. I'm going to let you make your own decision other than put Labor and the Greens last. That is, where we're at. I am fearful of an Albanese government. It's just going to get worse if those guys get in. I mean, mind you, I'll be honest here, we've got to lift our game a lot. And I've been very vocal about that. But I am fearful of an Albanese government. But look, long story short, voting in the lower house, fill out all the boxes, Labor and Greens last, and vote how you preference whoever you want, first, second, third, fourth, whatever. In the Senate, it's optional preferential, so you've only got to fill out the top line, or you can go. If you don't want to fill out the top line and you want to pick your own senators below the line, you've got to number 1 to 12 below the line. And that's it. You don't have to vote for everyone, below the line or above the line. So, those votes will not come back to the major parties. And that is a key difference between the upper house and the lower house, because of its optionality in the upper house. Votes don't have to go back to the major parties. In the lower house, every party has to have a number put against them. So it's who you put last rather than who you put first that's going to really matter in most seats. There's a handful of seats where there's independents or a non-major party candidate. And, I don't think we've got, Bob, but, Bob's Bob. He'll probably get back in. I'm not sure what's going on up there. But apart from Bob, I don't think there's any true independent, the Counter Party is Bob. But up here, it's not so much of a problem in Queensland, but obviously in other states, there's a few more independents running around, and then you've got the fake independents, or the so-called teal independents that seem to think that hot air sinks. That sort of logic just defies me. It could cause problems for the coalition in Sydney and places like that.
Is there a risk, because the 6th senator elected in each state doesn't need a full quota, is there a risk that people only doing the minimum number of boxes above or beneath the line on the ballot will actually exhaust their votes and end up being not used for anybody's, essentially favouring the Greens by letting their natural 8, 9, 10, 12% vote, which isn't a full quota, but still basically outnumber anybody else because of the lack of freedom voters' ballots counting through until the end?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dave. So, yeah, you'll get leakage. And this is one of the issues with having so many minor parties on the right. On the left, it's just Labor and the Greens pretty much. There's one or two other parties, but Animal Justice Party picks up a few percent sometimes. But there's not as many boxes to fill out if you're voting on the left as what you are if you're voting on the right. So it's very important to make sure that you're disciplined in the card. And, obviously it'll also depend on who you put first anyway. But look, there is that risk. But ultimately, you should make sure if you vote for, there's about 5 or 6 parties that if you vote for in the first place, which I think most of your listeners will, that they will get distributed. So there's a risk, but it's only if you're not disciplined on the card. And that's, one of the issues of having so many minor parties on the right versus the left. It's much easier to be disciplined if you're voting left, on the left side of politics than it is on the right.
Let's start surveying the parties. And we'll start from the biggest right-wing party, which is your party, the Liberal Party. Yeah. What are the pros and what are the cons of general party platform and policy and performance, the track record? Why should somebody who wants a right-wing government vote for the Liberal Party in the mix?
Well, look, I mean, let's put it this way. If you had 151 independents in the lower house, it would be very hard to form a government at all. So, look, and this is why I joined the major party is that I felt is that I wanted to have a say in the running of the country. So it's one thing, and you wouldn't, if you follow me or you sort of, I do throw, I tend to, I criticise my own party a lot, but it is, at least if you're in that party, I can get some leverage out of the major party. And I guess at some point you want enough numbers where you can become a legitimate force, and you can control the outcome to an extent. Whereas sometimes as independents you can get isolated, and if you don't hold the balance of power, it's very hard to get anything done. So that is the advantage of being in a major party. And I should add that, I went with the Liberals because I believed in the values of the dignity and worth of every individual, the importance of the family, freedom of choice, freedom of conscience, et cetera, risk, reward for effort, etc. I don't think it's a secret to many of your listeners. I've had a few issues with our inability to uphold those values in the 3 years that I've been a senator, which I find very difficult. Because I believe that if we say we're going to do something and we have these values, we've got to be seen to fight for those values. We mightn't always win the argument, but sometimes I think it's better to lose the arguments but stand on your values than cave in, and slowly the goalposts move further to the, or not the goalposts, but the outcomes move further to the left, or we appease the left. In order to get an outcome that might be a short-term gain for a loss of long-term integrity. So that's I am with the Liberal Party. Likewise with the National Party, it's a very similar view. I myself, son of a farmer. Grew up in a small country town, so I do have a lot of National Party outlook and thought processes within me, especially in regards to building infrastructure, protecting the regions, being more productive. But interestingly enough, I've also got quite a bit of blue collar labour in me as well. So people out of metropolitan areas who get up out of bed every day, put their nose to the grindstone, spend an hour in peak traffic going to and from work each way. Those guys, basically anyone that gets out of bed each day and puts their nose to the grindstone really and tries to stand up for themselves. So, then there's One Nation. I've got to know Pauline and Malcolm very well over the last 3 years. They stand up for their values. They fight very hard, and they take on enormous, they do a lot of work in the chamber and cop a lot of crap in the chamber from the left, especially the Greens. And I admire their tenacity and the way that they stand up for their values. So that's probably the three that I know, three parties that I know quite well. Obviously, there's Clive.
Forgive me, what are some, let's talk about some specific policies that you admire in the One Nation platform. And are there any specific policies that concern you in the One Nation platform that voters should be fully aware of?
Well, look, I haven't gone through their website to know what the policies are, but obviously, both myself and One Nation are on the same page with mandates about the vaccine rollout. Malcolm does a very good job in estimates, holding bureaucrats to account. We go hammer and tong, not just at the TGA and health departments, but also at, the Bureau and pushing, who try and the CSIRO who push their climate change agenda. So, in those regards, look, those guys fight hard for the little guy. It's, we're on the same page there. I'm not really sure what issues I've got with their other policies. I don't know that I've got any issues, but I haven't sat there and sort of read it, line by line. But I certainly go on very well with them. Yeah.
Now, what about the Liberal Democrats? They've got some pretty radical policies out there: a 40% tax-free threshold, a 20% flat tax rate, and a range of other policies that I think are quite innovative, and some of them are quite impressive. Are there any of them that particularly impress you or concern you?
Well, look, likewise, I haven't read their, I don't actually know what their policies are in a great level of detail. I mean, I like the idea of a flat tax if it was broad-based up to a certain level. Like I'm certainly for, like depending what the tax rate is, but yeah, I'm not against the flat tax. Provide, like I don't want to go too far down the tax over. It's got to be across several, broad ranging, so we don't have arbitrage between capital gains and productive income and et cetera, and foreign profits. I'm probably, and I've said this to the guys, some of the guys in the LDP, I'm more of a protectionist than a libertarian. I mean, obviously, I've been fighting very hard for individual liberties over the last 6 months in regards to the mandates and vaccines and the discrimination. And so I am a very strong supporter of individual choice and reliance, self-reliance, and responsibilities and things like that. I'd have to look. I mean, I'm not sure what their policy on abortion is. I'd have to have a closer look at that because
it's essentially conscience vote, up to the individuals. The libertarian approach generally is small government, no opinion, no regulation. Campbell Newman's specific opinion is that the Queensland laws are abominable, and he's personally completely opposed to late-term abortion or even abortion of any fetus that's viable or even long before viability. However, technically, he's in favour of a mother's alleged right to kill her baby early on in pregnancy.
Yeah. Well, I probably have issues there. And I'm not too sure. They got issues on drugs. So look, I don't know how loose they are with drugs either.
They definitely believe in ending the war against drugs and calling it a complete failure and spending that money to solve the problem with another creative policy approach. But essentially, they're after deregulating that stuff.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to deregulate. Look, and this is the thing. The government does have a purpose, and that's to do the things that individuals can't do themselves. So build roads, bridges.
I should have used the word decriminalize. They probably want to regulate, tax, and distribute drugs in a more responsible way than is currently happening. Using the example of the American experiment with prohibition of alcohol, and Campbell's definitely against drugs. His Vlad laws, which he now regrets as a libertarian, and seeing how police have abused their powers in the last 2 years, he thinks they should have done without it. But he's definitely wanting to fight the criminal enterprises around drugs. He's not soft on drugs, but the libertarian approach is one of letting people make decisions about recreational use for themselves.
Yeah. I mean, look. Without sort of getting too far into it, I probably, I'm sort of not necessarily against the laws that we have now. I wouldn't, confession, I do like beer. So look, there's a few things I think out there that I'd probably, struggle to support. But a lot of other issues I probably do support. So, and I mean, and of course, this is always the problem with parties is that, they might be 15 or 20 key policies. Right. You're going to have to go with the party that you agree with the most, but you won't still necessarily agree with 100% of everything. And that's one of the things I think today where, like, if anyone, like you just take the two major parties, you've got a range of views across the spectrum, right? And ultimately, you've got to make a choice. There's, most outcomes are binary to a degree. So sometimes you do have to rein it in, which is why, when I signed up to Age Party, I knew there were times I was going to have to rein things in. Don't get me wrong, but I can't rein in what's happened with vaccine mandates. I mean, that is just outrageous. And the ignoring of vaccine injuries and the discrimination. I mean, that is just a complete transgression of civil liberties. And I'm not walking past that, right? And I didn't sign up if I'd have known that the Liberal Party was going to help instigate some of these things, and even if we didn't do it directly, we've enabled the state premiers, 3 years ago, I would have, I wouldn't have signed up to this sort of stuff. So that's why I speak out on that, because to me, that's a core values. John Howard used to call them, that we have completely transgressed. And like many of your listeners are probably seething over it. It's, I still seethe over it. I'll be seething over it for a long time. So, yeah, look, but like all these things, I mean, I think on the majority of things, we probably have very similar outlooks with most of the other conservative parties.
I have some concerns with the United Australia Party. I think maybe, well, a handful. Let's be generous and say it's only a handful. They've got a lot of policies, but a handful of them are big government solutions, such as interfering in the mortgage pricing market, interest rates. Let's talk generally, though, but pros and cons of the United Australia Party policy platform that you're aware of and that have come to your attention.
Okay, well, we'll stick to that one. That's an interesting one. The whole, what was it, capping it at 3%? Was that it?
Yeah, for 3 years or 5 years.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I'll be honest here. I don't think the RBA should be an independent body that sets monetary policy. Full stop. I actually think that should be the role of the government. And a classic example of that is the RBA just came out yesterday and raised interest rates when 2 years ago they said they weren't going to raise interest rates till 2024. So a whole heap of people have gone out and borrowed money thinking that they were going to have lower interest rates to 2024. And the RBA has gone and reneged on that. So who's going to sack the RBA? Are they going to be held accountable? And why did the RBA just print $300 billion to destroy the economy? And then they've just turned the spigot off a couple of months ago, when really they should have kept it on to build new infrastructure. So in terms of the government controlling monetary policy, I actually believe that should happen. I don't believe, because there's got to be accountability, right? And when the RBA over the last decade have lowered interest rates, they've destroyed the savings of retirees. But who do the retirees take it out on at the election? Will be the government of the day. They don't get to vote the RBA in and out, do they? And then who has to make that money up when, say, Bob Smith had $1 million and he was getting 5%, 50 grand a year 10 years ago, and now he's got $1 million and getting 1%, $10,000 a year. We've now got to pay the pension. I say we, the government, the taxpayer. So the federal government, this idea that monetary policy and fiscal policy are completely different is complete rubbish. So I wouldn't pitch it the way Clive has done, because to say, put price on money and say it's not going to change in 5 years is not the right thing to do. But we do have an issue, and I said this is what democracy is about. It's all about accountability. And one of the ways governments are being eroded over the last 30 or 40 years are all these independent statutory authorities. And it sounds all very good because they're all supposedly independent. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing independent about these people. Everyone is driven by self-interest, right, in the first instance. So, another great example, and we won't waste too much time on this because I think we're on the same page. ABC, Independent Statutory Authority. Who holds them accountable? The Bureau of Meteorology, virtually independent statutory authority. Who's going to hold them accountable, right? The TGA, when they banned ivermectin, I went straight to Greg Hunt. He said, it's not my decision, it's the TGA. They're independent. Not on. So I think if I...
You're making really good points, Gerard.
Yeah. It's not whether or not we should be setting the price of money fixed for the next 3 years. I don't think we should be doing that. But he's right to point out that we need to have a discussion about who runs this country, whether it's the elected people, and you mightn't like us, but, every 3 years you get a chance to vote us out. And quite often, I get messages telling me off, or, you get slagged off or whatever. Or you want unelected bureaucrats who aren't accountable running the country. So monetary policy needs to come back in with under the domain of government. And rather than fixing interest rates for 3 years, we focused too long in this country on qualitative easing, i.e. the price of money. What we haven't focused on is the volume of money in the system. And when we floated the dollar back in 1984, we gave up control over the volume of money in the system. We have allowed domestic banks to borrow money from offshore, and we've unregulated that completely. Now, I'll give you an example of the impact of that. In 1985, we had $8 billion in foreign debt. By 2008, we had $800 billion in foreign debt. right? Now, where do you think that was where the banks went out and they borrowed money from offshore and they went and invested that in Australia. Where do you think that $800 billion ended up going?
China.
No, it went into the house prices of Sydney and Melbourne, right?
Oh,
we
sorry.
just inflated house prices from 4 times earnings to 13 times earnings. What did that do? That meant that the second parent had to go back to work. What did that do? That meant our kids got put into institutionalised childcare because the government won't pay you childcare unless you put them into institutional childcare controlled by what's the name of that? The union that can't remember the union that runs it, but is a big free for all for the childcare lobby on the conservative, not on the conservative side, but on the private sector side, and the unions on the public sector side, right? So, but now we pay interest on $800 billion a year to live in the same houses. So we haven't built assets. All we've done is inflate assets, right? So we need to change the whole way in which we deal with monetary policy. And we need to bring all that expansion of volume back onshore. It needs to be controlled by the RBA. And when they issue new dollars or new notes, they need to secure against an asset, not spend it. So what at the moment happens is banks go and borrow money from offshore and they give it to people, and the people either A, buy a house, which is okay because that's an asset, but we don't want them inflating it too much, or B, they spend it, right? Well, that's not good. What we really want to do is build and fund that through domestic equity or domestic sovereign wealth, and that is via an infrastructure bank. So what I would do, instead of fixing interest rates for 3% for 5 years, I would say I'm going to put in an infrastructure bank, and I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to build new infrastructure, dams, roads, power stations, etc. Number one, and I'm going to buy back all those sovereign infrastructure assets like power stations, airports and ports and railways that should be in sovereign, should be owned by the Australian people and should be accountable, because when the power prices go through the roof, they don't line up outside of AGL and Macquarie Bank complaining about high power prices. They come and complain to the government about it because people expect government to deliver essential services. They don't expect the private sector. They don't hold the private sector accountable. And this is another way how accountability is being eroded, not just through unelected bureaucrats and independent statutory authorities, but also because these foreign companies or private companies take over our infrastructure assets and we can't vote them out. And many of these infrastructure assets are now owned by super funds, both controlled by banks and by unions, yet again. So we are losing accountability of our sovereign wealth, and that has got to stop.
Gee, that was really interesting, and it made so much sense. I'm vehemently opposed to the 3% 5-year policy, but you put a really good insight into how we do solve that problem. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. We probably need to do a whole episode on some of the issues that you've raised here. Are there any other?
Can I just interrupt you there, Dave? Look, that's actually why I ran for politics. Unfortunately, COVID has just completely kiboshed all that. But once we get, smash this, hill called COVID and let people get back to work and, try and help those who've been injured and stop the discrimination, we need to build, like the way we're going to repay this $1 trillion of debt is to build. There's no other substitute for it. It's wealth for toil. It's in there. Our national anthem is the answer. Wealth for toil. Not for paper shuffling, not for changing interest rates or anything like that. There is no substitute for hard work. If you went to a desert island, you got washed up in a desert island, would you either A, go to a bank, or B, look to control the means of production? And of course, you look to control the means of production because there is no bank, right? A bank is a figment, something that's been created to pinch money out of people's pockets for doing nothing more than shuffling money around the economy. You need them, but, they shouldn't be the 4 biggest companies in Australia.
Let's do a public event forum, even just lecture, a couple of weeks after the election when the dust is all settled, and really spend some time ventilating this issue. We might have a 3-hour night, but if you're up for that, that would be super exciting for me. I'd love to make that happen. Are there any other pros and cons in the United Australia Party policy platform?
Look, I don't really know. Look, and I put in a plug for Craig Kelly down in New South Wales. When I did my first TV interview on Sky News with Tom Connell and Murray Watt many years ago, because many years ago now, I got beat up over the, I said the bomb were out of control and our public service was out of control. But I held my ground sort of thing. But, it was pretty hard when you're getting beat up on live TV. And the first person that called me was Craig Kelly, and he said, "Stick to my guns." And he's a top bloke, Craig, and he's a good man.
Yeah, agreed. He's definitely a credible, stable, known factor that is worth supporting if you're a voter in the seat of Hughes. Please do. This party analysis that we're doing right now in this podcast series is useful, but not as useful as actually getting to know the candidates in your electorate, because they will vary within a party, as you can see with Gerard Rennick, not your typical Liberal. And so that's why I'm against the slogan, "Put the majors last," because it's too simplistic and doesn't allow for the rare gems that you find in every party that deserve support without any kind of partisan prejudice.
Yeah. And the other thing is, can I just, sorry to interrupt you there, Dave? When we start getting held to account for our party, and I've been put on the spot a few times about why I'm in the Liberal Party and all this sort of stuff, and it's like that then makes other people in the, like, I'll speak out against my own party, right? When I'll call it as I see it, right? But there's other people in the party who won't do that. And so what you're doing is you're actually forcing them back into a corner, or forcing them back into their box more, because the media makes such a big thing out of if someone has a different view to the party message, and so in many ways it's making things worse. And we really I'm struggling at the moment, because within the Liberal Party there's I think there's up here in Queensland over 10,000 members, and 9,500 of those members are grassroots people who've been in the party for a long time. They feel very much like a lot of people in other minor parties. They're very frustrated. They get very frustrated when we don't uphold our values. And then obviously I'll have some people that don't like me because I don't stick to the message. But I've also got to remember, and this is why I'm with the party at the moment, staying with the party, because they put me there, and they also, the members, the grassroots members, need a voice, because a lot of the time they feel let down by their elected representatives. And now I may not represent the majority of the grassroots members, but I know I definitely represent a large chunk of them. And they need someone, they want someone who's going to speak up for their values as well.
Yeah, thank you for articulating that. I hear that as well. People are like just very, very emotional and irrational about party brands. And I hear some minor candidates saying, well, you should just quit the party and fight under your own steam like the rest of us. And my thought is, well, then they won't be in Parliament like the rest of you. They won't have a voice. They won't have influence. And we'll have scratched an emotional itch and felt good about screaming at the storm, but we won't have changed a single thing. So my solution is vote for the candidate that deserves it, regardless of which party you're a member of. Donate to the candidate that deserves it, regardless of whichever party you're part of. But join a party, and I think join the Liberal Party, because just like there was a long march through the institutions, this isn't going to be a single season, a single election solution. We might need a generation to save the institutions and re-infiltrate them back. And the best way we can do that is by adding to the grassroots and just making sure we're there when it counts at pre-selections, and supporting those people who are sensible and conservative and, dare I say, Christian, if they're somewhat authentic about it, but on the basis of their policies, not their party.
And that's dead right, Dave. And it comes back to the democracy and the dignity and worth of every individual. Again, it is the individual and the respect for the individual, and it's what those individuals do. Because if we start, putting everyone in the same box because of a brand, you're right. It is too simplistic, and it's look. One of the good things is going and ripping into my colleagues. That is one thing that it's important to do, because if they don't hear a counter narrative within the party, then they get caught up in groupthink, often set by a minister that's been set by a bureaucrat that's guiding the minister. So I get stuck into the ministers all the time, and I tell them they've got to think for themselves. They've got to listen to the grassroots members. They've got to listen to the people. and stop being controlled by the bureaucrats and dominated by the bureaucrats. So yeah, I mean, mind you, though, notwithstanding I'm, struggling, I do have my frustrations, and especially over this last 12 months. I mean, the first 12 months of COVID was bad enough, but the mandates and the injuries and the discrimination is just out of control.
Yeah, there's been a lot to be disappointed by, and I hope the Liberal Party receives some strategic pruning of some certain moderates so that better fruit and flowers may regrow in the summer after a winter. So I love that gardening metaphor. I think it's very useful for what needs to happen to the Liberal Party right now.
Yeah, I thought you might start singing the rose.
I just think, look, here's my basic premise, is that it's melodramatic to say the worst thing that could happen is an Albanese government. I actually think that left unchecked, 10 years from now, the Liberal Party of 10 years from now will be worse than an Albanese government. And so we need to check them now for the sake of our future. And that may mean we have to go through winter. That may mean we have to suffer a government that we don't want. And it's inevitable anyway. It's not like the Liberal government can be in government for the next century. But if we take advantage of these cycles and swings, we can send a message that's heard definitively. And I believe the same thing happened with Malcolm Fraser, that the Liberal Party prior to Gough Whitlam had started chasing the centre instead of being right-wing, conservative, authentic Liberal Party. And Malcolm Fraser brought it back and said, hey, why don't we differentiate like every business has to from its competitors? And why don't we just be right-wing instead of chasing the middle and appeasing the ABC? And they went through a period of growth and flourishing, which culminated in the Howard government. So I think this is just another time again, the Liberal Party needs to be reminded, you don't get to take right-wing voters for granted. We will go elsewhere and you will suffer opposition for a term or two.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's interesting. I don't define the world between left and right. I define it between big and small. And, my view, when you say appeal to the right, I say appeal to the people, who the majority are conservative, they're hardworking, and they're driven by the love for their family and the love for their country. And that's why I often call myself a protectionist. And I often take on the neoliberal free market fascists within the party, and I call them that to their face. We have a good banter over the fact that at the end of the day, and we've seen what happened with the extremists of that ideology. We've sold all our bloody infrastructure, and we've got no, ability to manufacture anything anymore. We've been ripped off by Macquarie or whoever owns the infrastructure. My view is, I want to protect my family. I want to protect my country. I want to protect our values and do that right thing and protect the little guy, because it comes back to this definition of democracy again. One is accountability, yes, but the other one is also the power of the individual, and empower that individual to be the best person they can be. And that's, I've had a wonderful life. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunities that this country and our forefathers have given us. But I also know that I'm a better man for having my own family and the value of that family, and how that's made me a better person. So, I want to empower people to get good jobs, to have a happy family life, and to be able to stand on their feet. And if we think like that, and not so much in his left versus right or whatever, that little guy, empowering the little guy, not letting the big guy choke off individual liberties and civil liberties like we've seen in the last 2 years, that's when we'll get the best outcomes.
Yep. No, I think you're right. Speaking common sense. For those people watching, if you're not a member of the Liberal Party, you won't be able to help make sure that Senator Rennick is at the top of the ballot for the Liberal Party at the next election. There may be him put in an unwinnable position, as we've seen with the Conservative this time, and a moderate protected at the top of the ballot. Unless you're in the party, you won't get a say on Senator Rennick's career. And if you want him in for longer, and people like him, it's not a plug for Senator Rennick, it's just a plug for participation. Your voice needs to be there unless you want other people making bad decisions for you in the absence of your voice. So be in there. This is how the system works. Be part of it. Because the consequences are people like Erica Betts and Amanda Stoker are out on their ear after this election.
Well, we can't give up on Amanda yet. I mean, we don't, because if she loses, it means another Labor or Green. It's Amanda versus Green, probably, or a Labor candidate. And we want the result we got last time when I got up, where we got three coalition, one nation, and two on the left, and that is very, very important, because if Albanese gets in, we want to be able to block stuff in the Senate, and it will be much, much easier if Amanda's there than if she isn't, because if she's not there, that's another vote to Labor or the Greens, and that's going to make it harder for us to block stuff. If we did lose the government, there is a chance that we can still control the balance of power with one nation, or not just the balance of power, we can actually block stuff in the Senate to stop Rain Albanese in. So it is very important to make sure you get all four of those candidates in, the three coalition plus Pauline in. And obviously,
you don't think Campbell or Clive has a chance of beating the Green? Campbell or Clive, you don't think their cumulative flow of preferences has a chance of beating a lefty?
We'll put it this way: I think Pauline's in front in terms of who will get the most votes, because One Nation got a combined vote last time, including preferences, of about 15.5%, 16%. So they're over the 14.3, and I actually picked up 1% back off One Nation. I was already in front, but it came back to me. So to get then a second minor party candidate up, you've done, or to get two minor parties up, you've got to get a combined vote, and all the preferences will have to be you have to be disciplined in your preferences to get it to 28%. So of the combined vote. Now, whether or not you can get from 15% to 28% in one election cycle, mind you, if it was ever going to be an election, this would be the one where the dial was going to shift, given what's happened with mandates and everything. That would be how it happened. So I'm not going to rule it out, and I know that the Palmer and the Liberal Dems are preferencing each other. It's probably, I hate giving predictions, and I do think that there may be a move on, but that's what would have to happen. The only way that Campbell would get in otherwise is if he got more votes than Pauline, which I don't think would happen with respect to Campbell. No, nothing against you, Campbell. I'm not saying it won't happen.
It's unlikely.
But, look, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the New South Wales Senate, where the Lib Dems, I think, have always been traditionally a bit stronger. They may push closer to 10%. That'll be an interesting one to see how they go on there. There's a couple of Freedom Party guys in Victoria. It's going to be interesting. And South Australia could be one to watch for One Nation. I think they picked up 5% last time down there. So, it could be interesting. And look, and the other thing is, if you've got anyone in Tasmania, if you know anyone in Tasmania, tell them this: do not vote for Jackie Lambie, because there is a real risk that if she gets someone else up, Jackie Lambie will control the balance of power in the Senate, and that would be a nightmare.
I agree.
We just cannot have that happening. So, Eric Betts, I know Eric, he's a great guy. Could have gone a bit harder on the mandates. He did go, to be fair to him, he did speak up quite a few times about it, but he didn't cross the floor that day, and he should have. But it would be much better to have Erica Betts in there, or One Nation candidate, than a Jackie Lambie senator, because if she's got the balance of power, I can't tell you how bad things will be.
She is a raving mad authoritarian tyrant. Her screaming sessions about forcing people to get jabbed are just unforgivable as a politician. That nobody can ever forget that, and must punish her at the polls for that.
Because I didn't wear a mask in the Senate. And look, I wear a mask on a plane for an hour. I mean, you take it off anyway when you're in there and eating, right? But I'm not walking around Parliament House 14 hours a day with a mask on. My throat, I know that I'm inhaling particles. I can feel it coming down my throat. I'm not wearing it, right? Like, I'll take my chances with COVID before sucking in microplastics into my lungs, right? But she had to have a rip, didn't she? And I tell you what, no thanks. And the thing is, and Clive, if you're listening to this, you put her in there, you'd better get her out of there. but she's gone from being someone who stood up for the battlers, and she's done the 180, where she's now being controlled by the Greens and the left.
Yep, 100%. And Topher Field, also great Senate candidate in Tasmania.
Yep.
So Eric Abet's Topher Field and One Nation candidate.
Oh, Topher's running in Tasmania. Is that for some reason I thought he was in Victoria? My apologies. Yeah, right. Okay.
He lives in Victoria, but he's on the Tasmanian ballot.
Right. Okay.
They needed a good candidate, and Topher is a fantastic candidate. So Tasmanians, don't hold his Victorianism against you. He's going to be exactly who you need to replace the mad cut snake currently holding you all to ransom.
Well, she's not up. She's got another 3 years. But
right, her party. Yeah, get rid of her party. Yeah. Senator Rennick, I really appreciate your time today.
You can guess who he's voting for. But it's only one vote, the same as anyone else's. When counting starts, it's soon obvious that there's a big swing against the government. The people have voted in one of the closest elections in Australia's history.